I think we should probably try and get going. We have one final session of what has been not such a long day, because it's been such a fascinating and engaging day, but thank you very much to all of you who've been here all day. Welcome to people who have just joined us for this final session. Welcome to all of you who are watching a later video podcast of this, who've joined us just for this part. We are going to have four contributions. First of all, LSE's Pro-Director for Research, Julia Black, is going to introduce things. I'm John Hills. I'm co-director of the new International Inequalities Institute. Then Tony Atkinson is going to talk. Some of you will have been in the audience 10 days ago, or it's 12 days ago, when Tony launched his new book, Inequality, What Can Be Done, a book which is available in the bookshop. And also that event, apparently available second-hand already on eBay, people who've already got to the end of it. But also, I should say, not just for those of you watching the later video cast of this, but you can actually watch Tony's presentation of that book on the CASE, Centre for Analysis of Social Exclusion website. It will be on the Inequalities Institute website once that's up and running, but also the audio cast with the question and answer session is available on the LSE events website, as all of today will be. And I should say that Tony's book contains 15 ideas of what could be done about inequality, and he points out that as the book is, I think, $14.99, that's less than £1 an idea. Is that? Which is very helpful. After that, doubtless, I think there'll be some people here who, if you still receive emails from an internet book retailer headquartered in Luxembourg, you probably already have been receiving emails saying that people who bought Capital in the 21st century are also buying Inequality, What Can Be Done. I hope, but there are other ways of acquiring books. And then we will, Thomas will take the floor. So, Julia.
Okay, so it falls to me to welcome you again, and to the launch of the International Inequalities Institute. And I'm truly delighted that we've got to this stage, actually, and truly delighted that you're here with us today. And I want to thank Thomas Piketty for joining us and for engaging so fully and openly in the discussions. I haven't been able to be part of all of them, but I have been talking to people as they've been coming in and out, and for everybody who's been involved in this, the reports coming back of this has just been a fantastic day of debate, engagement, and the other great thing is that nobody has ever really agreed with anything that anybody has said so far, which is just fantastic and exactly what we should expect. But the launch of the Institute, the International Inequalities Institute, comes at a really critical time in our social and economic development, and we know that debates on key social political issues get politicised very quickly, very easily, get captured by different special interest groups, and it can be very difficult to make any real headway beyond the rhetoric. And so there is a real need for coherent, rational analysis and objective debate on the causes, nature and consequences of inequality, and what we can do about them. And the LSE and the Institute is fantastically positioned, I think, to take that debate forward. We're a university, we do three main things. We research, we try to engage with the public in our ideas, and we teach. And so it's going to be no surprise that that's really what the Institute's going to be engaged in doing. For research within the LSE, this is a very important way of mobilising our existing research interests and capacity and building on that and bringing together different people across the school who are working on inequalities, but thinking about it from different perspectives. And you will have seen some of those already today. So whether it be from the economic, the political economy, the sociological, the anthropological, and so we go on. Ways of thinking about this particular issue, bringing those together to develop quite innovative research projects, we hope, and also be a a catalyst for galvanising research funding to try and fund some of that research to support those ideas and initiatives going forward. But we also need to take our research outside of the academy, and this isn't just an internal exercise which we're doing to help our own research improve, but actually to engage with others, both other academic institutions, but also engage with the wider public, policymakers, NGOs, international institutions, private sector organisations, to actually really engage with our research and also to get them to engage with us, because it has to be a two-way exchange. That's why it's called engagement and not just dissemination. Okay, to really try and understand the complexities of inequalities, not just from the academic point of view, here's what we think is fantastic, so you must like it too, because we think it's brilliant, but to think about, well, what are those outside really working on, what are the key problems that they're facing, and how can we help as an academy to really tackle those issues. So we'll be doing a number of different events. There'll be a series of public lectures, there'll be a series of briefings, etc. And so you just need to keep an eye out for what's going on. But we'll also be teaching. That's core to what we do. Okay, and training basically essentially master's students and PhD students to really be able to engage with issues of inequality using some really rigorous analytical and methodological techniques. So we're launching a cross-disciplinary MSc programme in inequality, and also have received from the Leverhulme Foundation £1 million to fund 15 PhD students over the next 5 years to train them on issues relating to inequality. And the Inequalities Institute will be a key fulcrum for that kind of training to develop in a really cross-disciplinary way. So this is just the beginning, and in the coming months and the coming years we'll be holding, as I say, a number of different events, engagements, initiating and developing various research projects. And so I just hope that you keep in touch with us and you just join us in building what I think is a really exciting initiative. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I think on behalf of Mike and myself and everybody else who's been involved in the early establishment of the Institute, a particular thanks to the LSE for its support in getting this initiative going. Now this session is focused on, in particular, on ideas around where this leaves us as far as policy is concerned. So we're going to be as well as giving Thomas a chance to respond to some of the general discussion we've had today, and I hope to some questions from an interaction with all of you. But we are at a particular moment. We are 4 days after a periodic chance to test the views of the British public on a series of issues. So I thought it might be helpful if on your behalf I read all 7 of the manifestos of the main political parties in Great Britain. I'm sorry to say, those of you watching in Northern Ireland, included Northern Ireland. And I've gone through them to look and see what the parties were promising by way of actions that related to inequality. And then in effect, what proportion of the of the Great Britain public put their vote when they were voting, obviously not representative of the entire population, as only 67% voted, what policies were favoured, or what parties' policies were favoured in this. So these are colour-coded. I think you can guess most of the colours. The orange figures here, the orange in here is the Scottish National Party. The Lib Dems, when they turn up, will be in yellow. I should say that anything coloured blue is going to happen. Anything purple may or may not happen. Anything green have equal representation to the in Parliament to the purple policies. So I've got 4 of these slides. And the proportion of the voters supporting inequality increasing policies are on the right, those voting for parties supporting inequality reducing policies are on the left. And in a way, this is about putting a challenge both to Tony and his 15 areas for policy development, and to Thomas and his proposals at the end of the book for things like a global wealth tax. As you will see, about 40% of the population voted for abolishing non-dom status that protects some particularly fortunate well-off people who have graves in other countries marked out for them from taxation. You will see that 51% of the voters voted for parties that are going to reduce inheritance tax, or in the case of UKIP would have abolished inheritance tax. That's by raising the inheritance tax threshold to £1 million is the policy of the new government. Some consolation for Tony that 3.8% of voters supported a party which believes in an accessions tax, lifetime accessions tax. A rather larger proportion of people voted for parties that would make the local taxation system, council tax, more progressive. Again, the same 3.8% were supporting a party which believed in an annual wealth tax or a global wealth tax. Moving on, thinking about direct taxes, there were explicit policies to reduce the tax on the top 1%. In the manifesto favoured by 13% of voters. But again, policies increased income tax allowances in the manifestos, both Conservative Party and UKIP, that's a majority, and including those are tax rates, and then including increased tax allowances, which most of the benefits of which go to the top half. That was about 60% of the population, including the people voting for the Liberal Democrats. But also, I've put down here the promises, in some cases, to be put in legislation now by the new government, but put, I'm not sure this one was actually put, it chiselled in words on the tombstone that was favoured by the Labour Party, but the policy of not increasing any of the direct rates of tax, income tax, national insurance contributions, or indeed VAT, in effect, in a situation where we have a deficit and where we have increased pressure on public spending through ageing, effectively leaves the government, as it would have been or as it is now going to be, with no option but to find regressive ways of meeting those gaps or those extra calls. There was quite more than 40% of the population did vote for parties that were supporting higher taxes on the top, direct taxes on the top 1%, but they were less than those voting the other way, of course. Then, as far as Social Security benefits are concerned, the governing party is committed to a cut of 10% in all all working age benefits. If it all comes out of, that's a £12 billion cut, which has as yet been unspecified where it's going to come from, that could either mean a 10% cut in all the benefits and tax credits going to all people of working age, including child benefit, child tax credit and so on, or it could mean simply a cut of a third in the amount that is paid to people who are out of work, whether they're unemployed, lone parents, or sick or disabled. Equally, we know there will be a cut in the real value of working age benefits, unless the rate of inflation remained at zero. On the other hand, virtually everybody favours state pensions growing faster than earnings. Pensioners are currently slightly less well off than the population as a whole, so I guess that is inequality reducing. I haven't put the Green Party in there, but they probably would be. They just said that they would have a much higher pension level. And indeed, the Green Party was also committed to doubling child benefit and to introducing a citizen's income, one of Tony's favoured ideas, in the long run, not immediately. And then finally, what about some other things, benefits and pay? In terms of constraining pay levels overall within companies, high pay limits, that was only something favoured by people voting for the Greens. Higher minimum wage, I haven't put the Conservatives in there because I'm not quite sure how the promise of the minimum wage relates to where inflation would have taken us to. The one policy on this slide where there was a very large proportion of people voting in favour, it was abolition of the so-called bedroom tax, the extra charge on social tenants who have fewer than the correct number of people for the house or flat they're occupying. As you'll see, 65%, nearly two-thirds of people voted for parties, including UKIP, that were promising that. However, you'll see conspicuous by its absence is a blue bar within that. So I guess that is not necessarily going to happen. And then to my mind, a slight surprise, given the kind of hardship which recent changes to council tax benefits have made, the idea of restoring full local tax benefits to people with no other income was something that only the Scottish National Party and the Greens were talking about. I think you may have noticed that there were quite a lot of votes for policies towards the right of these diagrams that have the effect of increasing inequality. And there was conspicuous absence of blue bars apart from pensions to the left of this. And I think that puts the challenge I was suggesting to Tony and to Thomas on where do we go from here?
Well, thank you very much, John. When you first sent me the slides, I was not too bothered. That's because I'm colourblind. But now you've spilt out the full significance, I am wondering if I should go home. However, starting a session about policy without referring to the election is obviously not very sensible. But I'm going to start not by talking about the manifestos, but talking about inequality and the media in the election. And I think the relationships of the media and its effect on the outcome of the election are something we're going to hear more about in the future. Having done that, I'm going to spend some time talking about the challenges for the economics profession in terms of analysing inequality. I'm going to say something about the role of different actors in reducing inequality. And finally, is it the wrong time, as I've just mentioned, to discuss policies in this area? Now, I think general opinion of the general election campaign was that it was extremely uninspiring, that it made little or no contact with the issues with which people were concerned or the big issues which face this country. And this is to a considerable extent, I think, the responsibility of the politicians, who remained very firmly within their comfort zone and didn't venture out to discuss any interesting ideas outside it. But I think it's also very much the responsibility of the media. They did very little, as far as I could judge, to broaden the debate. And as I'll tell you in just a moment, I have personal experience that they actually deliberately acted to prevent alternative views being discussed. They succeeded in closing down the agenda. And this, I think, certainly applies to inequality, a topic which I think many people thought would feature quite a lot in the election debate. But this was not the case. And just to test this out, my colleague Max Rosa in Oxford produced the following graph. He looked at the number of occasions, the number of sentences per day in the UK printed press in which the word inequality appeared. And you can see it starts in 2012, when it was about 5 times, it says 5 times a day it would appear. And then it increased in 2000, towards the end of 2013, 2014. That is the Piketty Effect. But you can also see But there was no evident further increase during the 2015 election campaign, which began on the 30th of March. The graph goes up to the beginning of May. So if anyone tries to claim that Labour lost the election by talking too much about inequality, then I think this provides at least some suggestion that that wasn't the case. If they did talk about it, then it didn't lead to any increase in press coverage. And as I said, speaking personally, and we've heard earlier today the importance of, as it were, of individual narrative as well as statistics, it was this period in which, as John has just said, I produced the book called Inequality, What Can Be Done, with certainly the hope that that would encourage a wider debate about the options that were open. To this end, the publishers approached a number of media outlets, and it led to an agreement with one newspaper that in exchange for giving them exclusive access, that is, that they could have the first, as it were, coverage of it, they would run an interview discussing the different policies by which inequality could be reduced. And the journalist visited me at home and wrote his piece, but it was then rejected by the editor on the grounds, I understand, that he did not like the economic message. In this way, he succeeded not only in preventing any discussion of the proposals which I put forward, but also blocked coverage in other newspapers. Well, what should they have been discussing? Here I was going to give one example which leads to one of the particular 15 proposals that I put forward in the book. Much of the election was conducted in the shadow of the deficit, of the need to restore the UK public finances. But that discussion was remarkably narrow. It focused on the deficit and the debt, but did not give us an overall picture of the fiscal position of the state. To do that, one has to look not just at liabilities, but also at assets. And that's what the second slide shows. And it's always seemed to me rather absurd that we talk about the national debt on its own without considering what the state owns. It's a bit like saying to someone, well, you've got a large mortgage, but ignoring the fact that they also own a house. And this figure here shows you not quite a complete picture, but a fairly complete picture of the net worth, that is, assets minus liabilities. And it's an updated version of an analysis that John Hills carried out, I think, in 1980s or so, some time ago. And you can see that it tells a somewhat sad story. It shows a story where the net worth of the state in Britain, from being negative after the war, steadily increased up until the end of the 1970s. So at the end of the 1970s, the public sector's net worth, which obviously there can be debating about how that's actually measured, but it's broadly a measure of the value of all the assets the state owns, less the national debt and other liabilities, but not, I should say, pension liabilities. That net worth was then about 75–80% of national income. Then it fell very dramatically until the end of the 1990s. And you'll see the same thing happened in the United States, where I've taken Thomas' figures with Gabriel Zuckman. And the net worth of the state is relevant because it affects not just the fiscal position of the state, but also it affects the distribution of income and wealth. Of course, an important part of the reduction in the net worth of the state was due to the sale of local authority housing at discounted prices. I think the current value of that would be about £200 billion. Now, that certainly increased the wealth of people not in the top 1%, but in the next group down, the middle wealth group. But that was obviously not equally shared. And we're seeing today, again, due to the work of case researchers, for example, here at the LSE, the widening gap there is between owner-occupiers and tenants, which was intensified by this process of privatization. And of course, the fact that the state's balance sheet is so unfavorable is one of the reasons why the government is unable to finance an adequate level of social transfers. And that's why I proposed in the book the establishment of a sovereign wealth fund, an idea which I should point out has been espoused by Boris Johnson, so that's an example of bipartisan approach. If we had established a sovereign wealth fund when North Sea oil came on stream and followed the policy of the Norwegians of investing that in a fund, that today would allow annual spending by the government of some £14 billion, which would have rather changed the election debate. And rather than having to look for 13 billion worth of cuts, the government would have this fund, if they had been in the past more fiscally responsible. Because the money from privatization was not, as you can see, used to retire the national debt. It was very largely used to cut the rates of income tax. But this, of course, is something about which I saw no reference in the discussion. We were constantly reminded in the press that the national debt had risen under Labour after 2007, and you can see the fall in net worth that took place then. But we were never told that it was under a previous Conservative government from 1979 to 1997 that the fiscal position of the state was so seriously weakened. That was my first point. Now, debts and deficits are the territory of macroeconomics, and I'm sorry I couldn't be here this morning for the session on economics. But I want to talk briefly about the engagement with the economics profession. In 1920, Hugh Dalton, later Chancellor of the Exchequer, said that as a student at the LSE, he had been especially interested in the distribution of income. And he then went on to say, I gradually noticed, however, that most theories of distribution were almost wholly concerned with distribution as between factors of production. He said the distribution as between persons, a problem of more direct and obvious interest, was either left out of the textbooks altogether or treated so briefly as to suggest it raised no question which could not be answered either by generalizations about production functions or by plodding statistical investigations, which professors of economic theory were content to leave to lesser men. He said men, nowadays he might have said differently. Now this neglect is still visible today in the allocation of space in introductory economics textbooks. If you look at the best-selling textbooks, you'll see that there is indeed usually, as for example in Greg Mankey's book, a very good, well-set-out chapter on income inequality and poverty. But it's quite separate from the other chapters in the book. Also telling in that case is that when Greg came to produce the essentials of economics, compressing the book into a single volume, the inequality chapter does not make the cut. The criterion he'd used was to emphasize the material that students should and do find interesting about the study of economics, and apparently inequality does not qualify. Now, I think the challenge, and Julia talked earlier about the Institute having a teaching element as well as research and dissemination elements, I think the challenge is to integrate the distributional dimension into the mainstream of economics. And it's this challenge that Thomas took on so magnificently in Capital in the 21st century. He managed to combine the fruits of plodding statistical investigations, and there's a fair amount of plodding, as you and I both know, from producing behind many of the numbers, even one number on his graphs, there's a great deal of work, to combine that with the high flights of economic theory. And whatever one view one takes, and I wasn't here for the discussion this morning, he succeeded wonderfully, I think, in attracting the attention of the economics profession and getting them to think about these issues. Now, building on this, I'd like to consider the implications for the new International Inequalities Institute, and in particular how to embed the study of inequality into the foundations of economics. And in my view, it should not be so much through a separate course or a separate lecture within a course, but to be present from the outset. And classical economists started from a world of workers, landlords, and capitalists, because these were the actors that were important in explaining the economy which they were observing. And so in the same way, I think we should start, as it were, from page 1, with different groups of the population, the top 1% perhaps, although I agree with Mike Savage that maybe that's not the most useful grouping, but some grouping like that, a middle income group of, say, of owner-occupiers and a bottom group of tenants. And each of these has different endowments of capital and labour, and each is affected differently by changes in wage levels, rates of interest, rates of growth, rates of profit. What's more, I think the state should be introduced from the start, providing the legal framework and context within which the economy operates, not introduced later as somehow correcting the market economy, since the market economy simply wouldn't function without the existence of the state. So these are some of the sorts of things which I think, obviously some of these kind of ideas are being built into the core undergraduate curriculum being developed by Wendy Carlin and colleagues as part of the INET, but I'm suggesting perhaps this is something which could be perhaps at the graduate level counterpart of that kind of development. In the same way, I think we need to reconsider the role of different actors in making policy. At the moment, attention is naturally focused on the national government in the case of the UK. But one of the themes of my book is that combating inequality is not solely the responsibility of national governments. Certainly, much of the heavy lifting may fall to them, but action does not only concern the national government, which I suppose is slightly reassuring for the 63% of UK voters who did not choose the present government. Now, what does that mean? First of all, the approach adopted is relevant to all levels of government, from local to multinational, from Oxford City Council to the European Union to the World Bank. In the case of the UK, there's obviously good reasons to expect the devolved governments, probably particularly in Scotland, to adopt a different approach from that forthcoming in the United Kingdom. In particular, there's scope for action to change the distribution of pre-tax, pre-transfer income, as again was stressed in my book, and as you will have seen from John's list, was not very much stressed in the case of the manifestos. There's a minimum wage, but not much else. And indeed, in some cases, action may be most appropriate at the local level, since, for example, in things like developing employment programs, the local governments may have a much more crucial role to play. But nor are governments the sole actors. It's individuals who will ultimately determine much of what happens. And there are many ways in which this can happen, and here I'm picking up on a theme which Lisa Mackenzie referred to this morning, about new and innovative ways in which people are seeking to influence what happens outside the mainstream political area. And it means that we can act individually in many different respects. We can act individually, obviously, as consumers. Consumers make a difference by buying from suppliers who are paying a living wage or whose products are fair trade. Individuals acting on their own or collectively make a difference by supporting local shops and enterprises. Savers can ask about the salary policy pursued by their shareholder-owned bank. As I stressed in the book, market forces may limit the range of market outcomes, but they leave room within those limits for other concerns to come into play, such as fairness and a sense of social justice. In this regard, the new III, if that's the right way to talk about it, should perhaps look inward as well as outward. We should be self-critical. And I'm sure in many respects the LSE's record is a good one. I noticed, for example, the LSE has for some time been signed up to the living wage campaign, something which Oxford University has only last month signed up to. But there are questions which can be asked more broadly about pay policy within an institution. In the final slide, I've shown you the distribution of salaries paid in this institution, upwards from £100,000 a year. £100,000 which is around 4 times the living wage, in which calculation I've assumed that LSE professors work 60 hours a week. I'm sure it may not be an underestimate. And from this you can see the fitted Pareto curve. I've used here the inverse Pareto coefficient, since I know that Thomas likes inequality indexes to go up when inequality goes up. And that's what this does, unlike the usual Pareto coefficient. And you can see that it has indeed, between 2010 and 2014, gone up a little. It's still well below the corresponding Oxford figure, which is 1.4. Now this preliminary examination suggests a possible research project for the new institute. These are publicly available data, and you could do a comparative study of English universities, for example, to see what contribution they've made to increasing inequality. Or if you're statistically minded, you could find a better fit to the distribution than the Pareto, which doesn't seem to fit terribly well. But the point I'm making is that in our everyday lives, we also, I think, play some role in affecting the levels of inequality. Now, this session is about policy, not research, and people may have felt after last Thursday that perhaps this seminar was beside the point. I'm not going to try to rise to that challenge that John made me, but I would point out that the title of the institute is the International Institute for Inequalities, and indeed the purpose of my writing my book was not simply for the UK audience in 2015. I think it's fair to say that around the world, judging by the response both to Thomas's book and then to my own, is that there is a very deep-seated concern about this issue, a concern which, if anything, seems to be increasing. And just as one piece of evidence, I've been struck by the shift in the US coverage of the book by book. In the first piece, which was in the New Yorker in March, they were quite generous about it, but said, basically, this is not very relevant, in the United States, most of his proposals are non-starters. No matter how many times you hear the word inequality on Meet the Press. However, more recently, 6 weeks later, the New York Times stated that Republicans are now speaking up. The United States is beset by a crisis of inequality. Who said that? Senator Mike Lee of Utah, a Republican with Tea Party support. They quoted the CEO of Goldman Sachs, who declared recently that we have to do a better job of curbing inequality. One feels in that case maybe he is himself able to do something about it. But in this respect, I think that the creation of this institute may in fact turn out to be very timely. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks a lot. Let me first say how glad I am to be here today, in particular to talk about Tony's book. And I guess the main message I would like to send today is, you should read this book. This is really, this is a great book. I think, maybe many of you probably know this, but Tony is in a way the godfather of all modern inequality studies. I think there are two, in my view, there are two big names in sort of promoting the development of studies on inequality in the past century, let's say it, which are Simon Kuznets and Tony Atkinson. So Simon Kuznets in the 1950s wrote the first major historical study on income inequality. He used for the first time the historical data from the US income tax and the US national accounts, which he was also a pioneer in US national accounts. And for the first time, he constructed historical series it was only for one country, for the US, and for a 40-year, in fact 35-year long period from 1913 to 1948, but it was the first time it happened. And Tony has been pushing this much further, in particular through many books over almost half a century now. And I first met Tony at the middle of this half century in 1991, 1992, so almost 25 years ago as a student at LSE. And Tony had already written a lot and has kept writing a lot. And I just want to single out, one relatively old book of Tony published in 1978 called Distribution of Personal Wealth in Britain, which looks at the history of wealth inequality in Britain using historical inheritance tax statistics from the 1920s up to the 1970s. And this was really pushing the Kuznets agenda even further, first because Tony was looking at the history of wealth inequality in this book and not only income inequality. And also, I think, because there was a much better, already in this book, a much better articulation between empirical data and theories that did Kuznets. Well, in the 1950s, you didn't have Excel, you didn't have, so the book by Kuznets was like a long statistical appendix, whereas Tony's book is able to present the data and at the same time to present the interpretation for the historical findings, the discussion of the theory. And Tony has been pushing this agenda further in the following decades up until today of trying to articulate theory with empirical work in a way which nobody else has done. And if you look at the list of Nobel Prize winner in economics, I think Tony should have received the Nobel Prize many times by these standards. But sometimes the dominant opinion among economists is not the right one. But this might change anyway. So what's really great about this book, this particular book, is that Tony is taking, I think, more risks than he used to. So Tony is often very cautious, in his more academic writing. So he gives a chance to every argument, and he's always very cautious in his conclusion, which is certainly a good thing, especially in a profession where sometimes people, are not particularly cautious about anything. But at the same time, you don't want to be cautious all the time. At some point, you need to take a stand. And this is what Tony does in this book, where he formulates a number of proposals about fiscal reform in the UK, but also reform of the labor market through a guaranteed scheme for employment at the minimum wage, a proposal about the capital market, the saving market, with a national fund for saving, with a return guarantee for rate of return on low and middle saving. So these are really proposals that go at the heart of the working of the labor market, the capital market. So it's not only redistribution, it's really an articulation between redistribution and pre-distribution, although Tony would not like this word and would not use it, but this is really what he's doing, I think, in a very, very deep manner. So let me just take a number of issues which I think are worth pointing out. First, what Tony said about looking at both the debt, the public debt, and the public assets is, I think, extremely important. And I think too often when we talk about the public debt, we do as if you didn't have assets on the other side of the balance sheet. And I think it's impossible to look at the history of debt without looking at the history of capital and the history of assets. You need to look at the entire balance sheet. And I think it's important to realize that a big part of the post-war growth regime came from the ability of government in Britain, but also in France and Germany and in many countries, to invest in public infrastructure, to make investment. And the way it happened is that governments all across Europe and in many other parts of the world were able to get rid of their public debt in the 50s, 60s, a huge public debt, in many cases over 200% of GDP, certainly in Britain, but also in France and Germany in 1945, the public debt was over 200% of GDP. And then it was reduced very quickly in France and Germany. It took a bit more time in Britain because Britain was a bit more averse to inflation. But in the end, in all of these countries, the public debt was reduced very quickly, and this is what helped build this positive net public worth and this ability of the government to make investment and to be part of the growth and development process. And it's in particular France and Germany, they reduced their debt from 200% of GDP in 1945 to less than 20% in 1950, 1955. And of course, this could never have happened just simply by reimbursing the debt through primary budget surplus. So otherwise, you would need surplus of 30% of GDP each year, which of course nobody has ever done. And so it's a bit ironical that these two countries, France and Germany, would never reimburse their public debt in the post-war period, are now explaining Southern Europe that they should reimburse their public debt with zero inflation, zero debt repudiation, whereas this is what France and Germany did in the post-war period. And this was an important part of the policies, these were good policies, because in the end, so there was inflation, there was a lot of debt restructuring, as we know, the external debt of Germany was cancelled, brought down to zero in the famous London Agreement of 1953, but it was more generally, there was a mixture of debt repudiation, inflation, exceptional measures which allowed for this quick reduction of the public debt, and that was an important part of the post-war development strategy, and this is what allowed the public sector to play its role. So I think it's important to have this broad historical view, not only on public debt, but on public assets. This is not saying that there are easy solutions. There's no easy solution. Inflation is a complicated solution, which has all of bad consequences as well. But the general lesson from history is that there are always alternatives. It's not true that there's just one way to reduce the public debt. When you look at history, you find a mixture of ways in France, in Germany, in Britain. Britain in the 19th century decided to reimburse its public debt with zero inflation, no default, and it also worked. It's just that it took an entire century. It took an entire century of budget surplus from 1815 to 1910 to reduce a public debt of 200% of GDP after the Napoleonic War to 20 or 30% of GDP in 1910. 1 century of budget surplus during which in effect, there was more taxpayer money in Britain used to reimburse the public debt to those who own the public debt, and it's not only in Jane Austen novels that you see interest payment. It's in the real public finance of Britain in the 19th century, and during an entire century there was more taxpayer money to repay interest than all the resources that were invested in the entire education system of the country, which maybe was not the best way to prepare the next century. And I think it's a serious concern that we might do a similar mistake today. I guess even more in Eurozone countries maybe than in Britain, where we stick to zero inflation to an extent which I think is dangerous. So in any case, my first point I wanted to make is I think Tony's emphasis on public assets, public debt is very important, and Tony's emphasis on the need to take this historical approach to this question is very important. Let me now come to two specific proposals that are made by Tony about the inheritance tax and the property tax, or the council tax, local council tax, which I think are very important because they illustrate what is so important in Tony's book, which is the spirit of, I think, hope and optimism. The idea that we can still do a lot at the national level. Even if you don't have a perfect international cooperation, there are policies like inheritance tax reform, council tax reform, and many other reforms that are proposed in Tony's book, which can be done here and now in Britain or in other countries, and many of the recommendations made by Tony can be applied elsewhere. And in the end, which narrative will become dominant? can change, I think, in the future. It's really there's no decisive argument, saying that we cannot do this kind of reform at the national level. So at the very interesting proposal made by Tony regarding the inheritance tax, and I think it will be interesting to conduct survey at LSE or in other places about how people feel about this, is to tie the inheritance tax rate to the capital endowment that can be made to everybody at age 18. So the simple computation that is proposed by Tony in his book is the following. If you were to use the current inheritance tax revenue to finance a capital endowment to everybody at age 18, including people who don't receive any family wealth from their family, then the capital endowment will be around £5,000 or a bit more. And with the inheritance tax proposal that you are making, this will be closer to £10,000, or that will be a possible target for an inheritance tax proposal. Whatever the specific numbers, the idea is to relate very clearly what you can get from inheritance tax rate. And I think people's attitude toward inheritance taxations are very complicated. People, of course, feel very negatively about inheritance taxation if you want to tax a lot relatively small or middle property values and wealth. Now, when it's very progressive, then people have very different feelings. And when it's tied to an endowment for all adults, I think the attitude, I think the framing effects and the way you tie the different parts of the reform are very important in order to change perception and attitude towards this kind of reform. So I think here the proposal made by Tony open very interesting new areas for research and also political action. The other example I would like to take is regarding the property tax or the local council tax. So I must say that here, by reading Tony, I learned something. Well, I learned many things by reading Tony, but in particular, I learned one thing which I did not realize before, which is that the famous poll tax of Margaret Thatcher, in a way, has never been abolished, or more precisely, it has been replaced by a system, the local council tax, which is almost as regressive as the poll tax. So the original poll tax was supposed, in its purest form, was supposed to be the same amount in sterling for everybody. But in fact, the new system, and there's a graph in Tony's book which illustrates this very well, is very far from being proportional with respect to property value. So typically, when you go from a property worth £100,000 to a property worth £1 million, your council tax, if I remember well, will move maybe from £1,000 to £2,000 or £3,000, but will certainly not increase by a factor of 10. So it's not exactly flat. It increases a little bit, but it increases much less than proportionally with the value of the property. So it's not even a proportional or flat rate tax, if you want. It's deeply regressive in the sense that how much you pay as a fraction of the value of your property falls dramatically with the level of your property or wealth. And what I find and so the obvious proposal made by Tony is, well, at least we should try to get back to a proportional property tax, and then maybe we can think of a progressive property tax or wealth tax in a second step. But we start from a system where in Britain, where as compared to many other countries, including the US or France, where the property tax is basically proportional, this is deeply regressive in this country, which what I find particularly striking is that at the same time, Britain is the country where the tax on real estate transaction is highly progressive, in the sense that when you sell a property worth £100,000, you have a very low, relatively low tax rate, less than 1% or 2%. And then when you sell a property worth more than £2 million, you now pay 7%. And this was first introduced by the previous Labour government before Cameron, with a 5% tax rate on all transaction above £1 million. And at that time, the Conservatives were saying, well, this is a catastrophe, don't do that. And when they came into power, they actually created a 7% tax rate for transaction above £2 million, which in a way, is an element for optimism in the sense, well, I know that this is not much of a time for optimism right now in this country, but at least what this shows is that, there are evolutions which sometimes can go beyond left or right, which simply, if you have very large property values at the top of the distribution and some people who are seated on huge property values, whereas some other people, in particular in the young generation, have a very, very, very difficult time to access property. It's, in a way, it's a matter of common sense to ask a little more to people at the top of the property scale. And what's a bit strange in the case of Britain is that this is what has been happening for the transaction tax, but not at all for the annual local tax. And, I don't know, from a French viewpoint, we usually look at Britain as a place, maybe not of fiscal rationality, but at least of more pragmatism or less, inertia sometimes than in France, where we have an extremely complicated tax system, and we sometimes imagine that Britain is a bit better. But here, there's a level of inconsistency between the regressivity of the council tax and the progressivity of the transaction tax, which is very difficult to understand from a French viewpoint. But at least what all this discussion shows is that these things can change, and there's a lot of arbitrariness in the tax system and social systems that we have in the different countries. These are the product of historical circumstances, and this can change. This is not something that we should take as given. Let me conclude by saying that there are maybe only two criticisms that can be addressed to Tony's book. Well, the first one is that it was published too late. That's quite obvious. It was, I think, 1 week before the election is clearly not enough. So I think this was a little presumptuous, maybe, Tony. You should have... so maybe 6 months before. But on the other hand, I think books can have an impact, have a long-term impact. And, election is only one component of political action and of political debate, and I think the book can have a strong impact on whatever the election. The other criticism that could be made to the book maybe is that it's very much centered on Britain, or at least on proposals that could be made in a country like Britain, which could be France or which could be another country, but there is not so much in terms of international action, and in particular, given the role played by Britain in the world map of tax havens, given the role played by Britain in competition over the corporate tax in Europe, you would have. I would have expected sort of stronger proposal on this side, and I think of course Britain alone cannot solve this problem, but it would be nice if Britain could do its share at least, and I would I would have liked to see a bit more in this direction. On the other hand, this is of course the strength of Tony's book, is to say, well, look, even if you don't manage to do anything on the international fiscal cooperation front, there is a lot that can be done at the country level. So don't take the lack of international cooperation as an excuse for not doing anything. And I'm going to show you what can be done here and now at the national level. So this is, in the end, the biggest strength of the book, which I really strongly advise you to read. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We started a little late, although it has been a long day, but particularly for Thomas, starting from Paris and sitting in the tunnel for quite a long time by the sound of it. But I think we have about a quarter of an hour to range not just over the points that have just been made, but other reflections on the day. If you are making them, could they be fairly brief? And could you just give us a small indication of where you're from, In the case of former members of Parliament, just indicate the part of Scotland you used to represent. So we have roving microphones at the top and bottom. I can immediately see two people, gentlemen with a blue shirt there, with the white shirt in the middle there, and then Lisa in the front row here for a first round of questions. So there are a lot of people who want to talk. Please do keep it as brief as you can.
So, hello, my name is Anton, London School of Economics. So I'm wondering, so you've got the optimistic policy recommendations for a more liberal government or for a more left government, but what are policy recommendations that the Conservatives and the government in the next 5 years would be liable to take or possible to take that would reduce inequality but still fit in with their larger agenda?
Thank you.
Yes. My name is Veronica Torres. I'm from Colombia, and I'm a PhD student in law. My question goes more towards the global inequality, and especially with regards the land acquisitions in the global south, let's say most Latin America and Africa. And we'll see that I don't see how we can tackle this with, for example, tax or education, especially if we see that these lands are being bought by, northern governments and also by transnational corporations.
Okay, I think we got the question.
Okay, good. Thanks.
I think one of those governments was protesting.
Hi, Lisa Mackenzie from the LSE, Sociology. So I said earlier that I'm not going to speak to policymakers because I don't think they would listen to me. But one of the things that I'd like to ask you is, how do we tackle policy around stigmatisation? Because the people in my study are stigmatised for who they are, and they're just not good enough. And what that means then is when you've got the Centre for Social Justice that comes along, they almost, the rest of the British public are then in agreement with sort of draconian welfare cuts. So how do we tackle, something as qualitative as stigma?
Thanks very much. Policies adoptable by Conservative governments?
Yes, I mean, if any of you saw, I think it was the week before last, Financial Times magazine, you may have seen that Tim Harford started off by saying I'd produce proposals for a radical Labour government, and then went on to outline things for a radical Conservative government. I then said to him afterwards, I said, well, actually, I think you've been a bit unfair, because several of the things under his radical Conservative agenda were actually among my proposals. And I said, I think you should remove the word Labour from my... Let's say I had radical proposals, not that they were radical Labour ones. For example, I'll just give two examples. One is that I was quite concerned that all the discussion about the distribution of wealth in this country has focused on the top, and not on the bottom, that is, on why people don't have wealth. And one simple answer why people haven't got much wealth is that the rate of return to their savings, or small savings, have been negative in real terms for the last 5 years or so. Now, it seemed to me that's clearly not helping, as it were. Their R is considerably less than G, to put it in my neighbour's vocabulary. And indeed, someone actually wrote to me and said, what is this man on about? R being greater than G. I haven't made any money on my savings for 5 years. And I think that's an example where we used to have index-linked bonds in this country. They were withdrawn, I think, somewhere was about 4 or 5 years ago, and have not been reissued. And I think reissuing index-linked bonds would be a natural step, I would have thought, for a Conservative Chancellor to take, for example. That is, trying to redress wealth inequality by adding to the savings at the bottom with limits. I think it wouldn't be allowed, as it were, without limit. The second example I'll take is one which Tim proposed, which was some form of citizens' income. He had even more radical proposal than mine, in the sense he wanted to abolish all other social security. I wouldn't do that for a number of good reasons. I think that, I'll go into, but some form of citizens, rather, or basic income would be a way of resolving what I think are the very inherent problems with our current social security system, which has become heavily dependent on income testing, means testing. I think it's 22 million people in the country are paying income, are receiving income-tested benefits, which is a really staggering figure. And it's very different from the original intention of the report drawn up by Sir William Beveridge in 1942. And the plan for social security was a plan for social insurance. And he was quite vocal on the subject that he wished to see this replacing social assistance, the means-tested public assistance, the old poor law, which brings me to Lisa's question. It's all right, you were below my eyes. Because I think that one element, it's only one element, but one element in the problem you identified is the fact that means-tested benefits are administered in a different way and are not regarded as, in any sense, return for contributions. And unlike many of my economist friends, I think contributions are actually important, partly because they legitimize precisely these transfers. And so I think that if we had a system of social transfers that was not a derivative of the old poor law, and there's a direct line running down from that through to current income support and job seekers allowance. If we had a system which went back to one which provided benefits which are either justified by contributions or by virtue of citizenship or something similar, then I think it would remove one of the elements of stigma. I think it's only one, and I think a lot of other things too, but it would, I think, help.
Well, as I mentioned in my presentation, if you take what actually happened to the taxation of property, in fact, it was the previous conservative government which actually created the higher bracket for property values above £2 million after they criticized the Labour government who first introduced it when they were in opposition. So I think they should just keep moving in this direction. But sometimes you have discourse, you have reality. I think in the end it will be perfectly consistent with what the Conservative Party pretends to be doing and the social groups that they pretend to be defending, to move toward a tax system in particular that allows groups with no family wealth to access property just through their labor income. So one way to facilitate this is exactly what Tony indicated. I think it's important to stress that financial deregulation has increased probably very substantially the inequality in access to high financial returns. So the gap between R and G might not be huge on average, but for some people it is a lot higher than for some other people for whom the rate of return has been very low indeed. So I think that's one way to correct this, and moving toward a more progressive tax system for property is also a way to facilitate new groups entering property. If you take the corporate tax, I think it's clear that if we keep just competing with one another in terms of European countries, we will have 10 years from now, the corporate tax rate will be 10% and 5% and 0%. And then what will we do? Are we going to subsidize firms so that they come and invest? So, everybody, including the Cameron government, has been complaining after the Luxembourg leaks scandal at the end of 2014. But, there will be other Luxembourg leaks scandal if we don't do anything. So I think even a conservative government, should try to contribute to more transparency about how multinationals report their profits, and more transparency regarding a register of cross-border financial assets. And sometimes, government don't do what we expect them to do. If you take, in the case of Spain, it was socialist government which repealed the wealth tax, which was then reintroduced by the Rajoy government, who was on the right. So I think we should just try to push in the right direction, and things can happen even when we don't expect them. Regarding the other questions on global inequality and land purchase, I think it will be a mistake we should stop believing and saying that restrictions are impossible, and that we should always have free buying of national assets by foreigners, free capital flows. If you don't have international coordination regarding transparency, who owns what, if you don't have minimal international coordination on taxation, then having completely free possibility to purchase assets in different countries and free capital flows is, I think, a big mistake, and is very naive. And so I think in some cases the only way to avoid this is to have restrictions on who can buy what.
Thank you very much. I thought you were in danger of saying just then that sometimes governments don't do what they say they were going to do. I'm going to take 3 more, and then we will have to wind up. So Tim Besley there was first. There's a gentleman right at the back in black, and your neighbour. So take those 2 at the back. Sorry, luck of the draw to everybody.
Okay, I'd like to join up the discussion a little bit to something that was said in the very first session this morning. But if you look, I think John was right to tee up the discussion in terms of the recent election. But I think it's also important to realise the amount of continuity there has been in policy, including the previous Labour government, meaning that they had an opportunity to do something about non-doms, did nothing. They had an opportunity to revalue the council tax in 2005. They abandoned that. They certainly did nothing towards the progressive introduction of wealth taxation. Indeed, they began, I think, to be terrified of doing so. In other words, there's a kind of social norm out here that our country has evolved, which says we are unwilling to say we're going to tax middle-income people to provide better state services. And until that norm changes and evolves, we're not going to have a fundamentally different system here. We're going to pretend that we can run election campaign taking money from pockets of the rich and provide better public services. There's a real need to shift the norm in the debate and to shift the norm in society. And all we're seeing in the election we've just seen is a reflection of an evolved norm in which people will not speak up for that strategy.
Back.
Hello. Hi. My name is Alex, University of Greenwich. I have 2 very short questions. We've talked about the role of the declining wage share and the role it plays in inequality, and I was wondering whether you could say a couple of words about the debate around this measure and the arguments, for example, put forward by Romney recently about whether to account for depreciation or not, and whether this has an effect on whether the wage share is actually declining or not. And my second question relates to the role of the housing sector, and it is being outlined as a new field of source of inequality and of struggle, and whether you could say something about the new institutional analysis we need in order to account for the erosion and bargaining power in this sector and how it relates to inequality. Thank you.
Thank you, and your neighbour, and if you could make it just one question.
Hi everyone, thanks very much for the presentations. My question is very close to his, so maybe I'm making like one question from his and all. So Bob Rowthorne presented that housing is currently 60% of wealth in the EU and 40% in the US. My question relates to your policy suggestion about property and inheritance taxes. How probable is it that these taxes are going to increase the supply of housing or provide an incentive for more people to have better access to housing, or have the opposite effect and exaggerate the fact that the landowners and the property class are going to charge higher rents? And what does this mean in the time of our amazing prospect of 5 years of this Conservative government? Thank you.
Wage share. So let me say very clearly that housing, the rise of housing values is indeed a very important part of the rise in the overall wealth to income ratio that I document and study in my book. Indeed, in some countries, it's more than 100% of the rise. So there is no disagreement about this. I fully agree that the rise of housing values is a very important part of the issue. Now, is this good news for inequality? Well, probably not, because indeed what this has implied, what the rise of housing values has implied, is that it's very difficult in particular for the young generation who don't have family wealth to access property. Okay, so if you only have your labor income and you want to become an owner in London or Paris, you have probably noticed that this will have to be a very high labor income. So, it's not impossible, but in my book, I try to look at different generations and look at what I call the Rastignac dilemma, comparing, how much what is the purchasing power of top labor earners or different groups in the labor earning distribution as compared to the purchasing power of different groups in the distribution of inherited wealth. And you have a return of the importance of inheritance, which comes together these very high property values, which is I think, a problem for our sort of meritocratic ideal of where people should be able to access property just on the basis of labor income. Now, what can we do about this? I think it's a mixture of policy. I think taxation is important, but I think there are many other policies regarding facilitating construction in some cases which are very important. So the problem to housing will be solved by a mixture of policy. Now taxation is also important, even though it's not the only solution. So in particular, when you are when you live at a time where the total wealth values, particularly because of housing, relative to GDP or national income, are 6-7 years of GDP as opposed to 2-3 years of GDP in 1970, then I think it's a matter of common sense that we should probably tax labor income a bit less and tax property values and inherited wealth a bit more. It's not 0-1, but you want to move the tax system in a direction that will sort of compensate for some of the underlying evolution in economic fundamentals, okay? Rather than exacerbate it. Okay? So you probably want to have a bit more tax on inheritance. On property and annual wealth tax, let me make clear that what I have in mind is not so much, it's not a total, an overall increase in the tax burden paid by property or wealth or capital, but rather to make it more progressive. So the proposal will be to reduce the property tax paid by households with low net worth, and in some cases negative net worth when you have a very high mortgage and a low property value, and to increase it at the upper end. So the objective is certainly not to overtax property in general, but just to allow for more mobility, to allow for people with no initial wealth to access more wealth. And I think it's clear that up to a certain point, this will increase mobility of wealth, reduce concentration of wealth without affecting the total quantity of wealth. And if anything, this will increasing access to property will be good for total accumulation of capital and wealth. Now, I think some of the reason why this kind of tax have proved to be difficult to reform in the past have to do with the lack of, to some extent, this tax should be more indexed to asset values than they should be. So in the case of the inheritance tax, what happens in many countries is that you don't change the tax bracket during 20 years or sometimes 30 years, and then suddenly you realize that you have 30% of the population paying high tax instead of 1%, and then you wonder why people are unhappy, and then so I think it's important as a rule to index your tax bracket, and if you really want more people to pay the tax because of a general increase in property values, maybe this makes sense, but this should be explained. You should explain why you do that. You should not just let inflation, and in particular asset price inflation, do the job, because otherwise at some point you have a backlash. And then it's easy for a government, and maybe the current government, to suddenly increase the threshold for inheritance tax to a level that is maybe excessive. So you have overshooting in adjustment, and I think we've had that in France also under Sarkozy in 2007. The inheritance tax system had not been changed in nominal terms between 1984 and 2007. So of course, given the increase in real estate values, 20 years before you had 1% of the population paying a certain tax rate, and 20 years later you have 20% of the population. So people are unhappy. If you don't explain why you are changing the tax system this way. So these are, I think that's part of the reason why reforming this has been difficult.
Tony, changing the norms and debate?
Yes, we have a very straightforward answer. I agree.
Right. Well, I agree. Well, no, I agree as well. But on the other hand, maybe, Tim, just to bring a little bit of disagreement, I'm not sure he should not be, saying this should not be used as an excuse for, concluding that we cannot have different policies, even given the existing norms. I think it's wrong to assume that there's only one, tax policy. I think one problem, maybe to conclude with a personal note, one problem I had with the more recent Merlis review of taxation is that I think it was a bit too, under the general idea that there's only one policy that can be followed. And at least Tony's book, I think, is showing that there is, even for a given country, Britain, with a given set of academic knowledge, there are different choices that can be proposed. And I think it's important for public debate to make this clear.
Thank you all very much. I'm sorry, I think we should bring this to a close in the next few minutes. I do have a couple of things to say, though, by way of announcement. The first thing is to say, in particular, a huge amount of thanks to the British Journal of Sociology, both for supporting this event, but also for publishing the symposium which led to it. We should thank Anna Johnston, her colleagues in sociology, who've organised what was really quite a complex event. We should thank all of our speakers. I'm not going to go through their names. In case you've missed anything during the day, this will all be, and that includes Tom in terms of the first session, thanks to Eurostar. This will all be available in probably 48 hours or so. It will be available online with the slides on the LSE website. I should also make one announcement, which is that the next event being supported by the new institute is a lecture which Joseph Stiglitz is giving next Tuesday evening, I think at 6:30, I think here. Now, tickets for that are expected to be in some demand. Members of LSE students and LSE staff can get one ticket each, I think, from the Students' Union shop in Houghton Street. I hope I'm not misleading people, from tomorrow morning. And others can get tickets online from 6 p.m. Tomorrow evening. That lecture will also, for those of you watching the videocast afterwards, that lecture will also be available by videocast. But finally, just could we join in thanking, I think, two people who have done more than anybody else in the academic world to change some of the norms of this debate. Thank you very much.